Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.
We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power.
The task force, with all its power, is ready. Britain has gathered its might. It must set its course.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
We're now between the two gun lines, and there's a right old artillery duel going on between them.
There is a white flag flying over Stanley. Very marvellous.
Welcome to Land, Sea and Air, Stories from the Armed Forces. In this series, we hear untold stories from the Falklands War, 40 years on. This is the story of the conflict, told by 8 different people who were actually there.
Hi, Steve. As you know, on the 2nd of April 1982, the Argentinians invaded the Falklands. And a day later, at a recalled Houses of Parliament, the Prime Minister announced that Britain would be sending a task force. And yet, only 5 days later, the dockyards managed to get a task force prepared for war. That is quite extraordinary.
So we're going to hear from several people in this episode. So we have a gentleman called Andrew Cave, who served upon HMS Hermes, although he's going to be talking about his efforts to commemorate the work of the dockyard, which has been quite a job by the sounds of things. But also a gentleman called Cliff Ball, who was a civil servant at Her Majesty's Naval Base in Portsmouth, and Mike Huitson, who was a dockyard worker at the very same base. So it's get 3 different takes on the same challenge.
I can't wait to hear all 3 of them.
Andy, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve.
So yours is, well, I think all of these episodes have been quite different. They're certainly different from what I expected. So I've heard a lot of stories from what one of our guests calls the deck plate, so from the shop floor. Yeah. And that's very much the aim of here. And I think yours is going to be unusual in the sense that you're going to be telling 2 stories, really. We're going to be talking briefly about your time on board HMS Hermes, which, as we all know, was deployed to the Falklands, but also the work you've done after the conflict, which we'll come on to in a moment. So, quite briefly, what happened in terms of the ship was in refit, as my understanding, and then was suddenly called to 72 hours' notice. What happened?
Yeah, so on the 2nd of April 1982, I was obviously on board the aircraft carrier of HMS Hermes. And she was in a dockyard assisted maintenance period. I think we were in sort of week 2 of 6 sort of thing. So she was in Portsmouth in a dockyard assisted maintenance period, and she had half of her ship's company on leave. And so it was the 2nd of April. So the ship's company had to be recalled. So it was a good job. It was the 2nd and not the 1st, I guess. But even then, I mean, even then, there was a lot of stories about people picking the phone up and going, you're having a laugh, this is a joke, or you know what I mean. So yeah, she was covered in scaffolding from the top of her main mast to the flight deck below, and she had great chunks of her main machinery, which had been taken off the ship and was being repaired in dockyards ashore. So she wasn't going to go anywhere for a long, long time. Nobody was expected her to go anywhere, sort of thing. And then I suppose for me, so about 7:30 in the morning, we had, we call it a pipe, but it's a call, instructing the ship's company to clear lower deck, which basically meant that we had to muster in the hangar, and we were going to be addressed by the commander. So there, at 7:30, we made our way to the flight deck. Nobody knew what was going on. Nobody had any inkling of the Falklands or anything like that. And basically, he told us that all long leave was cancelled and that we were to prepare to sail for war. The Falklands had been invaded by Argentina, and that obviously the Falklands was a British overseas territory. we had been tasked with many other ships to sail as soon as possible. To be quite honest with you, I mean, I was 17. I'd never heard of the Falklands before, and I don't think many people did, to be quite fair. I do remember there was a couple of blokes in front of me as we were dismissed and making our way back to the flight deck. They were talking about what the Argentinians doing in Scotland. So they didn't know either. And yeah, there was obviously an urgent need then to mobilise a fighting task force and to ready a fleet of warships and troop carriers and to sail in double quick time. And of course, this was an audacious and immense task that relied on the full commitment and cooperation of the dockyard workers. Just to put another spin on it, many of whom in Portsmouth on the 2nd of April, the day of the invasion, had received their redundancy notices, and that was as a result of the 1981 Defence Review by the Defence Secretary John Knott. There was going to be a lot of redundancies in Portsmouth and Gibraltar. I think Gibraltar was going to close, Chatham was going to close. The next thing I can remember thinking was that we were wondering whether these dockyard workers would return to work. That I don't know how many, but I think it was hundreds received their redundancy notices. And the next thing was, we were thinking, are they going to return to work? But yeah, they did. They worked round the clock, to make sure everything was done. They did an absolutely sterling job. They had little or no rest. They were working double shifts, totally dedicated to the task of getting the fleet out to sail, ready, prepared and ready to sail, really.
So it's quite remarkable, isn't it, really? You think, I've just been made redundant and, you need a lot of people to get a warship ready that's like not even halfway through a refit. So it's quite remarkable. It says a lot about them, doesn't it? It speaks volumes, I think.
Absolutely. And I often wonder whether, the same would happen today. I don't know. And when you put things like that into the mix, for me, they were a vital ingredient, really, to the success of the campaign. Not just Portsmouth, all of them. Against the clock, they really did achieve amazing things.
So could you give me a sense, because not everybody's going to know this, because I know when we talked about this a few weeks ago, I was absolutely amazed at the amount of dockyards and ports that we're talking about here. So, I mean, Portsmouth is an obvious one. We'd have all seen that on TV if we're obviously about them. But, so give me a sense of just how big this operation, in terms of the dockyards themselves, give me a sense of how big that was in terms of locations.
Well, yeah, we're talking about, obviously, Portsmouth. We're talking about Devonport. We're talking about Chatham. We're talking about Rosyth. We're talking about Faslane. Now, Faslane wasn't a dockyard as such. It's a naval base where the submarines are. We're talking about Southampton, who turned around to cruise liners, the Camber and the QE2. We're talking about Marchwood, which is in Southampton. It's a military port, and they turned around some of the RFAs. Ships like the Sir Galahad, which unfortunately never came back to these shores, was based there. Portland, of course, she was primarily used to work. We used to call it to work. You went to Portland to have a workup. So if you'd been non-operational for a little bit, you would go there and you would be subject to a lot of drills, a lot of exercises to make sure that you were ready. Gibraltar, of course, Hull as well. Now Hull was quite important because more ships were requisitioned from Hull than from anywhere else in the UK at that time. And of course, ships like the Norland, which I think carried the paratroopers to the Falklands, that sailed from there. So I think I've covered 10 there, which are the ones that are all unveiling a plaque. Some of them have already done it. Gibraltar did it on the 19th of April.
So just explain a bit more about, because obviously you were deployed to the Falklands yourself. You obviously came back, because I'm now talking to you. That's obviously, I imagine, an experience that's been seared into your memory. But upon your return, you were obviously still in the Navy. What inspired you to get involved in, I would say, celebrating and commemorating the work that people have done? How did that happen? How did any of that come to be?
It's quite a recent thing, really. I mean, I think it wasn't on my radar when I was still in the Navy, although I realised, like many others, what a fantastic job they did to put us to sea in such a short time. Like for us, it was 3 days. When you consider the state we were in, they deserve to be remembered. We went there and we got medals, and I suppose there were monuments built for the men and women who went there, but there was nothing for the dockyard workers. They might have got a thank you letter or something like that, but to me they deserve so much more. So I wasn't thinking of anywhere else really. I wrote to Portsmouth first, asking if it could be looked at that these men and women who prepared the fleet for the Falklands in 1982 could have some kind of recognition. I can't remember whether I mentioned plaque or whether that was somebody else mentioned it. I think a plaque was the right sort of fit, really. They couldn't be awarded South Atlantic medals because they wouldn't have fitted the criteria. So I think a plaque was a start, really, and I do think it's very long overdue, obviously, but.
You started with Portsmouth, I guess, because you were based in Portsmouth. And so how easy was this to achieve, or not, as the case may be?
To be quite honest with you, I was expecting it to be a lot more difficult. I mean, I wrote to a Portsmouth MP who was brilliant, and then they then wrote to the Commodore of Portsmouth Naval Base, who was, I'm told, on board straight away. He got in touch with the Portsmouth Dockyard Historical Trust, which Mike, who you've spoken to, volunteers for, I believe, and they did a lot of work with it. And I think, it probably came together in about a year, which I just wasn't expecting that, to be honest with you. It was only after that was unveiled, really, that I started looking at other dockyards, because prior to that, it just wasn't on my radar. It was Portsmouth because I had some knowledge because I was there. I'd seen it from my own eyes, what they'd managed to achieve, what it was like in those 3 days, from the 2nd of April to the 5th when we sailed.
So how many of these have you done? And what, is there any sort of memorable stories? Because as you've already alluded to, I've spoken to a couple of the people that and you've been involved with this, who we'll be hearing from later in this episode. But tell me about the story of the rest of these blue plaques.
Well, Portsmouth unveiled theirs on the 30th of October 2020. Rosyth's plaque was unveiled on the 4th of April. Gibraltar unveiled theirs on the 19th. I would imagine they'd start coming through thick and fast now, to be honest with you.
Well, it's absolutely the right time to do it, isn't it? It's the 40th anniversary. The national commemorations are on the 14th of June. So let's hope they do early June.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So are you able to tell me about what impact this has had on the people that you're commemorating? Because obviously many of them are still with us, aren't they? As indeed is many of the members of the task force. So I was just wondering what sort of stories you've heard from people, or what, particularly about the positive impacts, because we don't often talk about the impacts it may have had on the dockyard workers themselves.
I've had messages from families where their fathers who worked in the dockyard are sadly no longer with us. I was told it gives them a great source of sort of comfort to know that the work he put in, the work that they put in at that time, has finally been recognised. So there's been one or two where they've been grateful, but they've sort of said, why is it taking so long, sort of thing. And I totally understand that. I totally get it. But it's better late than never, I suppose.
Absolutely. So I don't know if you're going to know the answer to this question, but how many dockyard workers are we actually talking about? I mean, it's going to be a lot of people, isn't it? It must be thousands.
It's going to be thousands, yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't be able to put a number on it. I mean, they were all classed as military defence civil servants in those days. It's not like now where it's been privatised and it's private companies like Babcock and sort of BAE running the yards. It was all military defence civil servants. You must be talking thousands.
There was no internet, right? So, no mobile phones, and I dare say the technology, on board ship and, the way we repaired things was probably very, very different. Certainly no computers and robots and all this kind of stuff. So it's, very much manual work, isn't it? So you need a lot of people to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I was just trying to get a sense of it so people can appreciate, like we said earlier, you've sort of got, by some estimates, 30,000 people in the task force, and there's probably It could be getting near that number to get these ships to sea and with all the people on them.
So yeah, you're probably right. Probably right.
God, I bet there's a lot of stories there.
I'll have to try and find out.
Yeah, try and find out and let me know, because I'm sure me and Mike will talk about this after we finish recording this. You've managed to get hold of a couple of Portsmouth Dockyard workers who were actually there in 1982 and who worked round the clock to help get the ships ready to sail. Cliff Ball and Mike Huitson. And I believe they helped you get the plaque installed at Portsmouth Dockyard. And as a result, they will also be going out to the Falklands this year.
Recently, I was asked by Falklands 40 Committee in the Falkland Islands to pick 2 dockyard workers who might like to come back to the Falklands for a week, by invitation from the Falkland Island government. So I approached Mike and I approached Cliff, and they've very kindly sort of taken that offer up, and that should happen sort of towards the end of the year, I think, when the weather is a little bit better over there.
Wow, I'm sure that will be an emotional visit to the Falklands for both of them. Cliff and Mike were recently asked to give their accounts in St Paul's Cathedral as a reading of what it was like to prepare the task force 40 years ago, and they kindly agreed to record their speeches for us so we can give them a listen. But before we do that, I'd just like to say thank you so much, Andy. It's been fascinating.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
In 1982, I had the great honour of serving as the civilian officer in charge of the Royal Naval Supply and Transport Service MT Depot at Portsmouth Royal Dockyard. It was the largest of its kind in the country and supported Portsmouth Naval Base, the Royal Navy and Royal Fleet auxiliary ships based there, and a host of other naval shore establishments in Hampshire. I dedicate this piece to my former staff at the depot, many of whom are no longer with us. Sadly, the depot is now closed. Late in the afternoon of Friday, the 2nd of April, the phone rang. There was a political crisis of unprecedented proportions. British sovereign territory had been invaded. I was summoned immediately to a secret meeting in the dockyard, where together with a group of others I was made privy to the fact that the Prime Minister had decided to dispatch a Navy task force to retake the islands. It was further announced that the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes was to be the flagship. The British response was to be made public in the House of Commons by Margaret Thatcher the following day during an emergency Saturday recall. Well, I can tell you that after the initial euphoria, jaws dropped all around the room when it was further announced that the First Sea Lord, Sir Henry Leach, had decreed that HMS Hermes was under just 72 hours' notice to sail. She hadn't been scheduled to do anything for months ahead and was alongside, partially de-stored and in a state of some disrepair. All those in attendance, including myself, had something to do with kitting her out and getting her seaworthy for her long journey south, and we were speedily dispatched with that challenge in mind. My team and I were responsible for the ship's vital all-wheel drive aircraft towing tractors, and they were all ashore in a multitude of pieces and in various states of overhaul. Their role was twofold. As well as the obvious, moving aircraft to and from the hangar and around the flight deck, they also carried and supplied demineralised water. This was injected into the Sea Harrier's Pegasus engine to improve its efficiency and increased lift during fully armed vertical or short takeoff operations, critical in Operation Corporate. When I returned to the depot, I was met with disbelief when announcing that no ifs or buts, all of the tractors had to be in one piece, serviceable and back on board, and all by the following Monday morning. After their initial shock, the staff were marvellous. Plans were hastily drawn up. Weekend arrangements were cancelled, families were notified, and round-the-clock work began. Parts were made, mended, cannibalised, and if not actually stolen, were appropriated from every conceivable source. I personally contacted the directors of a number of parts suppliers in the city of Portsmouth. They immediately agreed to stay open for us morning, noon and night over the whole weekend. If they had it, we got it. No red tape, no paperwork, no payment. That was all taken care of later. There were people in, on, under and around every tractor. Refreshments were brought in and work continued ceaselessly day and night throughout the whole weekend. I am delighted to say that on the following Monday morning, with great pride and more than a sigh of relief, I watched from the dockside as the last of the tractors was craned aboard at one end of the ship as the Royal Marine Band was playing for her departure at the other. Classified at the time, it's now no secret that on leaving Portsmouth, HMS Hermes limped her way south with almost as many dockyard technicians on board as crew. She was literally being put back together during the voyage as other vital stores and equipment were air freighted to meet her near Gibraltar. The rest, as they say, is history. Following her epic achievement, I was privileged to be on board one of the leading tugs during her triumphant return. The mass of boats, water jets, helicopters, crowds, sirens and flags thronging the Solent, Spithead and the whole of the waterfront had to be seen to be believed. It is a sight I shall never forget. Paraphrasing the inimitable words of the late BBC journalist Brian Hanrahan, who was embarked on Hermes, I counted her out and I counted her back. Well, as you've heard, on the day of the invasion, HMS Hermes was in civilian hands. She was undergoing an assisted maintenance period in Portsmouth Royal Dockyard. From the top of her mainmast right down to her flight deck, she was covered in scaffolding. Much of her main machinery was ashore in the civilian workshops when the call came. A task force consisting of warships, troop carriers and supply vessels, both military and civilian, had to be assembled and assembled immediately. They would have to sail 8,000 miles and fight a war with no land-based air support. It was an audacious and seemingly impossible plan. HMS Hermes as the flagship was key, and her readiness relied heavily on the commitment of the civilian dockyard workers, many of whom had received their redundancy notices on the very day of the invasion. There were those who questioned their loyalty. Would they return to work? Well, return they certainly did, and they toiled around the clock and with little or no rest until the fleet was fully prepared and ready to sail. When the chips are down, I am pleased to say that there are no more loyal servants than the civilian workers of the Royal Dockyards. Portsmouth Dockyard readied 39 ships in record time, nearly a third of the 127-strong Falklands fleet. In total, 255 British souls lost their lives in the Falklands conflict. That number included leading cook Michael Foote, a family friend who's lost his life at the age of just 23. Michael was serving on HMS Ardent when she was hit amidships on the 21st of May in Falkland Sound. 22 of the ship's company lost their lives. The ship was captained by Commander Alan West, who went on to become First Sea Lord before taking up a political career. He is now Baron West of Spithead. 649 Argentinians also fell in the conflict. I respect them all. Clifford Ball, Ministry of Defence, retired.
With a potential redundancy letter in my pocket and feeling very let down by the government's job-slashing decision, I left work and drove home along the northbound M275. Suddenly 6 Sea Harrier jets appeared alongside me, flying really slowly, but going in the other direction towards the dockyard. It was surreal as I could clearly see the pilots in their cockpits. Upon arriving home, I received a telephone call from a friend asking me if I'd heard the news that the Argentinians had hoisted their flag on the Falkland Islands 8,000 miles away. As I reached for my atlas to check exactly where the Falkland Islands were, my boss called and asked me if I'd returned to work. I got straight back in the car and more or less only returned home to shower, eat or to sleep throughout the time of the conflict. The next day was incredible, a sight that I'd never seen before or since. Lorries laden with stores and equipment stretched nose to tail throughout the entire length of the dockyard and beyond into the gridlocked Portsmouth streets, all bound for the ships of the task force. Despite the staff feeling very aggrieved by the government's decision, everyone rallied and gave 100%. I didn't hear the phrase, "it's not my job," throughout the conflict. Jobs that would previously have taken weeks to complete were finished in days. Workers came up with innovative ideas and solutions to resolve problems rather than negativity. I worked night shift for months and frequently arrived home from my shift at 9 in the morning to then receive a phone call request to return to work. My role was maintenance electrician of the dockside cranes and plant. Capital plant and machinery were all working 24/7, which was way beyond their design intent. Hence, machinery was frequently breaking down and required speedy repairs. With a colossal amount of steel fabrication and modifications being carried out on most of the vessels in the dockyard, the night sky over Portsmouth was continually lit up with all the arc welding flashes. The atmosphere on site was electric. People you've never spoken to would approach you with updates or hot off the press news. There was a real sense of we can do this, and we did. We all watched the task force leave Portsmouth on April the 5th. I remember being shown a couple of copies of ship's signals. HMS Hermes thanked the yard for their magnificent support, and my personal favourite from Royal Fleet Auxiliary Stromness signalled, "The dockyard is a worker of miracles." Great for morale, of course, and who knows, we all quietly thought, our achievements could save our jobs. I witnessed most of the ships returning from the conflict. One of my strongest memories was when HMS Glamorgan berthed alongside North West Wall. Families were crowded on the dockside, banners held high, anxiously awaiting their loved ones. With the crew stood to attention on board, and with the ship only 20 or 30 metres from the jetty, one of the sailors broke ranks, removed his cap and hurled it like a frisbee towards the jetty. Within minutes there were sailors' caps everywhere, including the sea. This episode obviously went round the fleet as caps were flung ashore by all the returning ships' companies.
Now, before Stephen might look back at the interview we've just heard, you may be interested to know that here at Company of Makers, we've got loads of online activities for veterans to get involved in. As well as this podcast, we've got online talks with inspiring guests, and we've got workshops where you can learn something new and meet like-minded people from the forces. To find out more, sign up for our newsletter and we'll send all the latest updates direct to your inbox. Just head over to companyofmakers.com/newsletter. Now back to Steve and Mike.
So, Mike, I promised you something quite interesting here. I think there was so much in there that I knew nothing about, although I was only 16 at the time.
I can't believe you were ever 16, Steve. However, I think actually there'll be an awful lot of people in the same boat as you. I don't think many of us recognised quite how much the dockyards got involved. And when you think about it, it's obvious, but actually a lot of people haven't thought about it. So I'm really glad that you've taken the opportunity to have these discussions.
Yes, and I think Andy realised that a lot of people hadn't thought about it or certainly not commemorated it. And, you know, his sterling efforts to ensure that happens need to be spoken about.
Yeah, absolutely right. And because he was actually serving in the Royal Navy at the time on board HMS Hermes, which was the flagship for the task force, he describes how that she was just a week or two into an assisted maintenance period of several weeks, with scaffolding from head to foot and main parts of her main machinery, taken out, and she was all extensively weeks, probably months away from going to sea, and yet the Prime Minister announced that we'll be sending a task force within 5 days.
I can imagine the skipper's expression when he was told that.
Well, yes, and I think what this whole thing represents is the extraordinary efforts of lots of people, but we're going to concentrate on the dockyard workers, about how they managed to turn that around. Because, I mean, the context of this was in the wake of the 1981 Defence Review, the dockyards and a lot of the jobs there were going to be lost because the Defence Review foresaw a smaller navy. And so I think very, very recently, days before, a lot of the dockyard workers in our dockyard ports, Portsmouth we're going to be talking about, had been given redundancy notices. So imagine, what their mood must have been like, when all this was taking place.
Yeah, so you've just headed home, you've got your redundancy letter in your pocket, and then the phone rings.
And you're asked to come back in, put all that aside, and prepare a task force for war in a matter of days, not weeks. I mean, it's an extraordinary effort. And I'm really glad that you've got these interviews, because I don't actually think people do recognise quite how much the dockyards contributed to the success of the Falklands campaign. And we rightly spend a lot of time on the heroics of the men and the women that were on board all the ships and the aircraft, submarines, and on land. and they got recognised with South Atlantic medals and things like that. And yet, none of them would have been able to do it had the dockyard workers not put their redundancy notices in their back pockets and forgotten it, and worked round the clock to get the task force ready. And indeed, some of them sailing with elements of the task force to complete the maintenance that they couldn't do in the very short period of time they had alongside.
Yeah, so you've got, as we've talked about before, the conversion of stuffed ships taken up from trade to be suitable, fitting them with helipads and Lord only knows what else. And of course, as we've said, HMS Hermes was not in any position to be deployed at the time.
She wasn't, and the fact that she sailed and she was the flagship, and she was able to make a major contribution as an aircraft carrier and as a command centre was crucial to the war effort, and what the dockyard team did. And it's really interesting to hear the two inserts that you've put into the recording about from the dockyard workers themselves about what they had to do to get the ships away is really quite jaw-dropping.
It is, yeah. So what did you think about what they had to say from Cliff and Mike?
They were both very poignant. Cliff's reading, of course, he did it in St Paul's, first-hand experience. Again, here's another example of someone talking about events 40 years ago as if it was yesterday. Those memories are still very, so it's not just people in a war zone, it's people preparing people for a war zone that have these very vivid memories that, don't sort of wane with time. I think we owe a lot to people like Cliff and Mike, who he was doing quite a lot of the work around in the MT depot in Portsmouth, providing the tractors needed to, move the aircraft around the aircraft carriers. And, we wouldn't have won the Falklands without those aircraft. So everybody has played a part in this, and it's extraordinary how everyone came together, put differences aside, and just worked as a team. I wish we could do that more often.
Yes, I quite agree. But I think it is the scale of the operation, isn't it? We often have spoken about the 30,000 that sailed south for combat, but, I wonder how many thousands were involved in preparing all these ships. So that's another one of our competitions coming up, I think.
Yeah, you did actually ask. You did actually ask Andrew, and he wasn't aware. But let's hope we can find that out, because he also spoke. He's taken up on it. So he's a sailor. He was a sailor at the time on board HMS Hermes, but he's taken it upon his shoulders to try and get the recognition that he felt that the dockyard workers deserved, which he didn't think, and I agree with him, really, really got. And he's identified 10 dockyards. So obviously, Portsmouth and Devonport, but not everybody, was aware of Hull. I think they are now because of the MV Neuland and the other ships that were taken up for trade there. But also Southampton, Marchwood, Faslane, Rosyth, and Gibraltar, which of course was home to those ships excising in the Med, the Spring Train. This is where Coventry was. That then turned them around to turn left rather than right, has been reported. And also, I think they refitted the Uganda as a hospital ship as well. So, all these dockyard ports did great things, and he's going round getting plaques established. I think he's done 3 so far, with another 7 to come, so that people really do know what the dockyards did during the Falklands.
Yes, and those plaques are imminent, aren't they? Their installation is imminent in early June, so it's very timely, of course, with the 40th commemoration.
Very timely indeed, and so he's clearly very passionate about making sure this recognition is, and he said actually it was easier than he thought. He was pushing against an open door. The campaign to get the first one up in Portsmouth, actually was. He took only a year. He was expecting it to be a lot longer than that. And yet in October 2020, during the height of the pandemic, as we know, he managed to get the first plaque unveiled. And he's now got 2 others. One was done in Gibraltar last month in April, and another was in Rosyth, and the remaining ones are scheduled for either June this year, about the time this the podcast is broadcast, or maybe slightly later than that. So extraordinary.
Yeah, I think the fact that it was easier than any anticipated is an indication of the desire of the people he was talking to get it to commemorate. And I think that speaks volumes that the effort of the dockyard workers is actually recognised, although not officially until now.
No, thank goodness for that. There's another thing about this, which is if you believe that you're involved in a just cause, if people believe that the cause is right, and the people of the UK in 1982 en masse largely did, then they're all going to pull together and put against personal differences and things like that, work together and work whatever God gals give in order to achieve the outcomes required. And that's what happened in April 1982. And actually, the dockyards continued supporting them throughout the conflict. It wasn't just getting the task force away in 5 days. It was a continuous level of support throughout. And then, of course, they had to then welcome them back and repair them, mend them, because they came back, quite, badly damaged in some cases, as well. So the dockyards did well.
Yes, and also HMS Hermes setting sail with workers on board, I believe.
Yeah, no, he mentioned that. And, that's not uncommon, that actually, if you are sailing to tight timelines and you haven't finished, you get all the maintenance that requires you to be able to sail safely, but you may still have some, stuff to do that can be done en route. So they would have embarked the dockyard workers to Ascension to finish off what maintenance they couldn't do before she sailed. The important thing was to get all the main bits working, which they obviously did.
Yeah, and get the flagship down south.
So I think there's a big shout out to people like Cliff and Mike, who were part of the dockyard team back in 1982 for what they managed to achieve, and I hope that this podcast gives them a bit more recognition they absolutely rightly deserve. And also big shout out to Andrew for his efforts in, he wasn't a dockyard worker, but he obviously saw the efforts they put in to get his ship, the Hermes, turned around, and what he's doing to try and ensure they get the recognition they do. So I think it's a fantastic listen.
It is, and I think, it's so easy not to recognise these things, isn't it? So you're right, it is a sterling effort. But I'm surprised you haven't talked about frisbees yet.
that was an eye. No, I haven't. But and I didn't know this. Every day's a school day with Steve Bomford, I say. Or your podcast series. But I didn't know that when Glamorgan came in to Portsmouth. And as is traditional, you have the ship's company standing in formal procedure for a ceremonial procedure for a port entry like this, and they were all very stiff at attention till one sailor decided to remove his hat and throw it like a frisbee. Of course, it didn't reach the jetty; it went in the water as you'd expect, and all of a sudden, all the sailors did it. So there were lots of hats in the water. And then this seemed to become a thing that the rest of the fleet did as well, although I wasn't aware of that. So that's right. I mean, I'm sure it was frowned upon at the time, but looking back at it, it makes you smile, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I'm sure it was frowned upon, but it's a great story, isn't it? And to think that went through the fleet.
Yeah. Well, I also think it's, part what makes a British sailor great. The same that makes them sing always look on the bright side of life. On the forecastle of HMS Sheffield when she's been hit. I think this stoics and the sense of humour is what makes the British sailor the greatest in the world, in my humble opinion.
So there's a quiz question for you. What have Monty Python and HMS Sheffield got in common?
And here's another one. What have the dockyard workers ever done for us? Well, the answer is absolutely loads, and we owe an awful lot to them.
Indeed we do. Thank you again, Mike.
You are most welcome. Hi, it's Mike here again. So just to let you know, this podcast accompanies the stunning Falklands 40th commemorative book produced by the Veteran.uk on behalf of the South Atlantic Medal Association, SAMA 82. And we'd like to say a really big thank you to both our funders for making this possible, namely the Veteran.uk and SAMA. And if you'd like to buy a copy of the book, then please head to either the Veteran.uk website or sama82.org.uk. Thanks for listening.
Before we finish, we'd love to hear from you. So if you've got any thoughts, suggestions, or even a bit of banter, just email us at podcast@companyofmakers.com. You never know, you might even get a mention. And don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you. This podcast was produced by Rachel Owen, hosted by Mike Davis Marks, and me, recorded and edited by yours truly.
Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.